Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts, Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John, explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. How are you today, Nora?
Very well, thank you. And how are you doing, Brian?
Doing good. It's been a busy day. I was up at 4 a.m. and it's, even though this is going to drop after the new year, it's just before the holiday season that we're recording this. I went at 4 o'clock in the morning to the post office and got my stuff mailed out. Thank goodness they have those little kiosks that you could just, weigh your thing out, put it out. So I was like, oh, no line, no nothing. I was like, yes, done. I'm finished with those. So yeah, I got a bunch of stuff done even, before my day started, and my day's just rolling right along.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very nice.
And I can't wait for what we talk about today, because it is, I've called this the F word in fitness for quite a while. It's sort of something that I can't tell you how many times I've heard trainers or Pilates or even yoga instructors use the term and talk about fascia. And you can tell they really don't know what they're talking about. So I can't wait to dive in on this. You and I have both taught classes on this, multiple classes. So we come from a wealth of knowledge. You have a little bit more of a deeper dive, more depth than I do. So I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions because there are still some things that I'm still interested in and learning. So yeah, I thought we would do this, and it's going to be a multi-part. So we're just going to keep going, and we'll hit, the basics of fascia today. And I thought next week we might talk about thoracolumbar fascia, how to train fascia down, So this will be a multi-part topic, but I think at the beginning of the year, it's a great place to start.
Awesome. All right. So fascia.
So what is fascia?
Okay. Let's start at the beginning, shall we? And build up from there. Actually, I want to even talk pre-beginning, which is why it came into our world anyway.
Yeah, please.
So fascia, for those of you who don't know what fascia is connective tissue. It's a very broad term for connective tissue. How it's used a lot in our world of movement is the myofascia, which is the fascia associated with muscles and tendons and joints, and how all of that goes together. Fascia is connective tissue, meaning that it connects different cells that do different things in different parts of the body. So, for example, in our muscles, our fascia surrounds each individual muscle cell, and then we'll wrap those muscle cells up into little bundles, and then we'll basically be the surrounding of the entire muscle. If any of you have ever taken apart a chicken,
now, this
raw
is exactly what almost everybody brings up. Every time fascia is brought up, it's like, okay, have you ever taken the skin off a chicken? That's usually what everybody sort of brings up.
Well, that's the deal, right? Because there's the skin, and then when you take the skin off, it's connected slightly and loosely to the layer underneath it, right? Like if it's turkey time, right? Or was just turkey time, and oftentimes you're trying to loosen up the skin and put things between the skin and the turkey.
Yeah.
That's one layer of the fascia. So the skin attaches down to that silvery coating that covers your muscles. That's what we call kind of the deep fascia, if you will. It surrounds all your muscles, but that's just a superficial layer. Every single muscle fiber and the whole muscle has a tiny, tiny coat around it. And then those fibers are also wrapped up into bundles by another little fascial connection. And then all of those fascial connections, all those fascial coats, if you will, that surround all the muscles and all the fibers will come together to form the tendons.
Okay.
So the tendons are like the conglomeration of those. One example I use here, or one image that I have for this, which may or may not work for you, but we'll see. If you think about somebody holding a whole bunch of balloons.
I was just thinking about that.
Right? I use this from the movie Up. This was my image from the movie Up. Right? Somebody's holding a whole bunch of balloons. So he's got a whole bunch of thread of strings in his hand. And then there's a whole bunch of balloons above him. In a way, I think of the fascia as being the string that is attached to, and the balloons in this crazy example are the muscle fibers or the muscle bundles, bundles of muscle fibers. So that when you pull on those strings, of all those balloons. It affects the whole situation, right? You can pull the whole thing down, the whole thing up. And it's that collected energy from all those muscle fibers that comes through the tendon to attach to the bone or wherever it's attaching to move what it's going to move.
What I've always found interesting is when people do try to explain fascia and say use the chicken example, is they only use that superficial. They say you remove the skin, you know, that white stuff, that's fascia, and that's where they leave it. I think it's important to understand the deeper levels that it goes to every single muscle cell. So it goes from a group of cells, so it's around a cell. Then a group of cells, it's around the group of cells. Then a bunch of those bundles come together and it's around those as well. So there's tons and tons of these connections, almost as though you start with string that's really, thin, almost like dental floss. But by the end, you've got this rope.
You got a rope.
Yeah.
Yeah, really good. Because you know how ropes are often multi-stranded.
Right.
I mean, a big rope has all kinds of strands that have all been kind of woven together or twisted together to become rope. It's somewhat the same thing in terms of the tendons and how all that fascial tissue comes together. And that brings us to the reason why we care about it, maybe, or one of the many reasons, which is that those fibers connecting from the muscle through the tendon to the bone often then connect to other fibers going to the next muscle, going to the next tendon, going to the next, etc. So there are these channels or these chains of fibers of myofascial tissue, fascial tissue that connects us from our toes to our head in many, many different directions and in many different ways to create all the different movement patterns that we perform.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to understand how much fascia is, connected with movement.
Well, one of the things that, yes, it's critical. Without it, we got nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, that is how force gets transferred from the muscle tissue, the muscle actual cells, into anything else.
Yeah.
So another silly example, if any of you have ever played with a jellyfish or seen a jellyfish, right? They move, they kind of have that very smooth kind of rhythmic motion that they have. Mm-hmm. But they don't really have any bones, for example, right? So like they can contract and move that way. Our muscle cells can do that too, but unless they're connected to something to move, they can't really do anything. They would just sit there and sort of squirm, if you were. That's kind of a gross image, but they would just kind of squiggle in the dish unless they're connected through these fascial connections to other muscles, to tendons, to bones. And then they have their action is at those distal points, not really right where they are. That makes sense.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. You need the combination. You don't just want the muscle itself, because if, like you said, if a muscle's not connected to anything, it's just a blob. So you need that connection to the bones in order to make any type of movement, in order to create that contraction which causes the two bones to come closer together, or the joint to, shorten up in the direction that we want. This leads to a question, though. When we're talking just a second ago, we were talking primarily about myofascia. Now, when you talk about connective tissue in general, would bone be considered fascia?
It's considered, it's part of the connective tissue process. Bone and blood are part of the connective tissue kind of part of the body in terms of those tissues. And there's some debate about whether it's kind of a fascia or not. There's just some debate in the universe about it. One of the things that, if you look at the microscopic structure of bone, it is basically calcified fascia, which it is because our bones start as cartilage. And cartilage is essentially connective tissue, is essentially related, one version of fascia. And then what happens with cartilage is as it grows and as we grow, it gets calcified, and that becomes our bones eventually once we've fully calcified our skeleton. And if you look at the trabeculi, the deep structure of the inner bone, not the outer smooth surface, but the inside, it looks a lot like fascia, which is this kind of lots of different connections, like a web-like structure, which is really how those tissues connect.
Interesting. Yeah, and I remember when we went to the fascia conference together, that it was very interesting to listen to the arguments You know, some people were saying bone is definitely part of fascia, and other people say no, that's separate. And what that always brings me back to, whenever I lecture about this topic, I always want to remind people we are at its infancy still.
Yeah.
Of understanding and research of what fascia is. Because even though, I was looking online earlier and they said, the first time people were talking about it was, 3000 BC, they have these documents. And then, it was written about in the early 1900s, it was written about. And that Ida Ralph, developed some of those theories based on some of these writings. And I thought, well, fabulous. But in truth, we've only been hearing about it in our industry for probably 25 years or so. I know it came more from body workers and Ralphing.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's still in its infancy, and research being done on it is really still in its infancy.
It is. So everything we say, with that, the caveat that anything we say could turn out to not be true. I mean, not entirely, but just know that this is not, a lot of this is not settled science. There's some moments of pure speculation, which I will try to point out. Mm-hmm. And there's other moments that are like, no, they kind of think they know what's happening here. One thing about that is when you think about dissection and the history of dissection, for a long time, like until, again, about the last 25 to 30 years, maybe a little longer at this point, time keeps flying, you would essentially remove the fascia to get to the good bits.
Right.
The fascia was considered in a lot of Western science, Western biomechanical science, was considered a passive container.
Mm-hmm. Packing
it was considered
material.
Like saran wrap, right? Just containing stuff and holding it together, connective tissue, without necessarily having a role.
Yeah.
And what has been discovered since then, let me back up one moment. Let me just say, what are all the different kinds of connective tissue or fascia that we think about? So ligaments are fascia. Tendons are fascia. We've talked already about the muscle structure and how that goes into the tendons. Mm-hmm. Nerves are also have fascial structure to them. The organs are basically a fascial scaffolding, if you will, that then the individual cells for that particular organ get developed within that fascial structure, which is why the liver looks like the liver and the spleen looks like the spleen. And then again, bones that we talked about. So those are just different things to think about with fascia. But coming back to why we care about that, it's this idea that understanding those interconnections and understanding the role of fascia has radically changed how we think about movement, how we think about the integration of movement, like why we can actually throw a baseball as a classic example, right? So I'm going to use that as actually an example to talk about this. A couple of science things that came up that spoke to the role of fascia. One is that, let's say you're going to throw a baseball, you're going to do something fairly ballistic and speed oriented. The muscles actually respond, or I should say that the speed of release of, let's say, that wind up into the throw is faster than can be accomplished by the muscles alone. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the muscles cannot, according to biomechanics, contract fast enough to create that speed of a release. Okay. So one of the things that they discovered is that it's the fascia that actually winds up. So fascia is not particularly stretchy. Well, I'm going to use that term for the moment. It has the ability to absorb energy and then to release that energy very quickly if timing is done appropriately. It's called elastic recoil. Mm-hmm. So again, it's not like a rubber band because it doesn't have that much stretchiness to it, but it can store energy on a contraction and release it. And that's what creates the speed of something like a jump, something like a throw, something where we're really, ballistically moving something quickly through space. Mm-hmm. You wind the tissues up, and it's the release of that tension on the tissues that can cause speed. When they realize that, they're like, well, what's doing it? Like, if the muscles can't do it, and even the nerve impulses aren't fast enough to account for some of those speeds, mm-hmm. They realized it's just these biomechanical properties of the fascia that actually create that speed.
Interesting. You said that fascia doesn't stretch very much. And because it's surrounding, there's so many different layers of it. and there's so much of it that if it even stretches just a tiny bit, when you're really creating this long line or band of it, of all these connections, it probably has a little bit more give to that than we think. But when we're creating that elastic recoil, it's sort of like winding up, what I always picture is if you take a look at a spring, not compressing a spring, but if you twist the spring. You know what I mean? If you twist a spring, it doesn't go very far, but it creates a lot of torque. It creates a lot of energy, but it doesn't have to in a small. Whereas I think of a muscle contraction is more like compressing the spring, squeezing the spring, rather than twisting it. That, in my mind, is sort of how I've separated, that elastic recoil.
Yeah, I like that. I have to think about that. And then in your case, if you have just twisted that spring and you let it go, what happens? Spring.
Yeah, it comes back to
it pops. It pops out of your fingers pretty quick and kind of bounces across the room.
Yep.
So there's a fair bit of energy that's stored just by that tightening up of those fibers, if you will.
Exactly.
Now, one thing that's funny about that is that release often happens from a stretched position. So if I'm thinking about a jump, for example, the energy in the Achilles tendon in a jump is stored in the stretched phase.
Right.
So I've stretched it to the maximum point of possibility, basically. So there's enough tension on those tissues, and it's the release of that tension that creates the ballistic action of the jump.
So it's like preloading the muscle.
Yep. Same thing with a wind up. You think about a wind up, like if I'm doing a rotational wind up for a throw.
Right.
You think about that happening from the compression or thinking about my body going from the back of my body is contracting, the front of my body is stretching, and it's that wind up and that release oftentimes of the elongated tissues that creates that movement.
Yeah. When I think of something like this, I also sort of think about like a cat. When a cat jumps, it elongates. I've seen, and I've always found this fascinating, and I think of it when I do work with athletes, because you want to create that stretch, that elastic recoil. You want to create that timing of the stretch preload to explosion. And I say, think of a cat, how it crouches before it jumps. Okay, it makes itself as small as possible. And then it takes off, and you can literally see it extend. But what I found fascinating is in midair, you'll see the back of the cat actually begin to approach the front of the cat again. And almost like a spring would push it off again. So it does this interesting sort of recoil. And I try and explain that the timing needs to be perfect with that elastic recoil, with that pre-stretch, that preload, as you're about to throw, because I can reach my arm back and hold it there and then throw, and I'm not going to get anywhere near the same distance as if I use that elastic recoil, reach back and let it, boom, explode.
I do the same thing a lot in jumping. Jumping is kind of the example I use because I'm a terrible thrower. So like elastic recoil doesn't happen when I throw, even though I had a Labrador for like 14 years and threw the ball 17 times and it never got better at it. But jumping's the same thing. You can jump, and if you jump and you let it time, so it's like land up, right? It's really quick. That's one, right? That will give you that speed. If you stop, even for a moment at the bottom, it takes 4 times as much energy to get up.
Yep.
It's like, right? And that's that elastic recoil feeling, that you really have that ability. Like the energy is much more efficient when it's, again, the tissues are creating the energy rather than the muscular strength creating the energy.
Interesting.
It's a way of being more efficient in the body, right? Because the tissues just boing, release the energy that's stored up in them without having to necessarily use, I presume, a lot of ATP or a lot of energy stores in the body.
And we're not talking about just a simple one group of fascia. So let's say for the jump, we're not talking about just the fascia that goes from your calf to your Achilles tendon. We're really talking about the entire body, because we're talking about loading everything from the foot through the Achilles tendon. You're also loading the anterior portion of your calf. You're preloading that tibialis anterior, the quadriceps, hamstrings, glutes, low back, everything all the way up. And if you watch a basketball player, they're jumping with their arms almost as much as they are with their legs. You know,
Yeah.
if you tell them,
Yeah.
hold your arms by your side and jump, and then use your arms like you're going to slam dunk a basketball, you're generating a lot more momentum and power using your arms as well. So you use your
Yes.
whole body.
The chain, which this gets us to this idea of myofascial chains or trains. Thomas Myers with anatomy trains is one of the most thoroughly researched and explored views of this. There are other views in terms of how these trains or chains of muscles go together, chains of myofascia go together.
Sure.
But again, that example of the basketball player was great because what you see there, what you see in most functional movement, in all honesty, the squat or a lunge or walking or running, is you see those connections of those chains. And another thing that came out of research was that the force of any given muscle, let's say I'm doing a bicep curl, right? I'm just bending my elbow. Well, we know the brachialis is going, the coracobrachialis is going, my biceps going. Like there's a few muscles working, but the force is not only in those muscles. A lot of what's happening there is being spread out to the forearm, for example, in that case, going through the wrist flexors, as an example, going up into the shoulder. So the force generated in one muscle is very, very commonly spread through the chain, either up or down, or even the antagonist will actually be experiencing some of that energy. So these trains or these myofascial chains or these myofascial meridians, there's lots of terms for it, are really trying to look at those relationships and how force moves from one piece to the next, to the next, to the next. If you think about the core, for example, I always think of the core as a classic example of this. You've got the transverse abdominis, right, deep in the core. It comes up to the bottom of the rib cage. Right? Well, its myofascia, so its fascial connection to the bottom of the rib cage, is in the exact same area as the bottom of the diaphragm. Right? So you think about that connection that we always talk about between breathing, the transverse abdominis, the diaphragm, the pelvic floor, etc. You come down to the bottom of the transverse abdominis, you go through the fascia there, it's along the iliac crest, and then it's along the inguinal ligament. Fascially, that's going to have some relationship to the inside of the pelvis. Right? So it's going to also there's some fascial connections that go down from the transverse abdominis down even into the pelvic floor, if you follow the fascia along. So there's always these connections that we make where things work in a coordinated fashion, which is how we move. We don't move typically one joint at a time or one muscle at a time. We move in complex ways for the most part.
Absolutely. When looking at the meridians, I was actually pulling up some pictures of them. I found limitations with some of the Tom Meyer stuff. And I know a lot of his came from doing body work, and totally understand that. I find the functional lines are a little bit more according to what we do. Because they sort of made more sense to me than looking at, just the deep superficial front line or back line, because that almost didn't make sense to me, because that was just looking like, oh, here are all the muscles in the back and how they all, yes, they're all connected. And you can see that even in something like a deadlift or a squat, where when you're coming up, you're getting your entire back engaged, you're getting your hamstrings, you're getting your glutes, you're getting your calves, everything is firing. But that doesn't mean the front's not firing as well. So I've sort of looked at that and thought, well, that made sense for body work for me, but the functional lines made a little bit more sense because it almost had more of that crossing action, almost like the spiral line that he talks about, or the functional front line or functional back line. You look at those and you think, okay, that's more about what we do because it involves rotation. It's not just flexion and extension. It involves a lot more rotation, which we walk, we rotate, we move. A lot of what we do involves rotation of the body.
Well, humans are primarily designed around a rotational functional axis.
Absolutely.
Right. And I compare that. So if you compare us, for example, to a quadruped, like the cat that you were using, right? Cats' primary mode of locomotion is two things. One, they have that alternating limb action, right? Think of them trot, 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 trot. But again, if you think about a cat springing and trying to get some real, or really moving very, very quickly, they're moving primarily sagittally.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're opening up into extension relatively and then flexing quickly,
Yep.
and then opening up into extension and flexing quickly. So they tend to be a little more sagittal. But humans, as soon as we stood up right, rotation was the only way that we could mobilize.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you ever tried to walk without rotating your torso or your hips at all,
Mm-hmm.
you can do it, but you're not going to get a very long stride.
No.
And if you try to run without moving your pelvis, if you ever watched a person run who's trying not to move their upper body at all, it looks kind of funny, because they're missing that ability of the whole body to participate.
Well, anytime you've worked with someone, I don't know if you've worked with someone who's had like their sacrum fused, or certain fusions, they suddenly have a hitch in their giddy up, and you watch them move, and you watch them walk, and you're thinking something's missing, and you may
The
not be able
force
to.
is not transferring.
Yeah, the force isn't transferring. It's sort of getting blocked at a certain area. It's like the force comes down. It's like,
Yep.
and below is working and above is working, but there's no cohesiveness working from the upper to the lower body. Now, when I was taking physics in college, it was interesting for me because I was so interested in the human body. I couldn't care less about other things. And what dawned on me when I was sitting in class one day, it was like a light bulb going off in my head, and you probably had this way before I did, but it was like almost all human movement, every joint is rotational. Every joint is rotational movement. And if you understand rotation, length of limb, you understand, you're lengthening your lever arm, all of that, it just immediately, physics made sense to me. Because I could put it into my body and I could fit, and it just was like, oh my gosh, everything is rotational. Every joint. You think about this, everything works along that rotational axis of some sort. And you watch us walk, you watch someone run, you watch someone throw, you watch almost any movement. It's got to involve rotation. And that's why I've always sort of broken down movement that you would see, forgive the term, but cadaver-like, just take the body and just flex here, do this, and make it among functional activity, and it changes how we look at the body and how we should train it.
Which is honestly an insight that is not widespread in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
We really think about the simplicity of the sagittal plane, even the simplicity of the frontal plane are very appealing.
Sure.
You think about how many people view movement, view exercise, think about progressing exercise, think about programming exercise. That is the reference point. But typically, the sagittal plane is the first reference point. Pilates, that's for sure true. But in fitness, I think as well.
Absolutely.
And once you start to get into looking at the rotational components, things get more complicated immediately. The eye is not as tuned, I find, to rotational patterns, and it takes longer to identify an imbalance in a rotational pattern than an imbalance in a sagittal pattern, typically. So it's interesting. That's an early insight to have had that, Brian, in terms of your process. No wonder you've gotten where you've gotten.
It was just one of those moments that I was like, we should be moving more like this. But I don't know if you've ever had this experience when it comes to rotation and training something. And this could be, I'm just going to put it out there, it could be that we all know in every profession there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. You've got incredible instructors, you've got some mediocre, and then you've got some horrible. But just training the sagittal plane is easier. Just training the frontal plane is easier. Because we all know, if I took every single listener out there and I said, okay, we're going to throw a ball. Use your right arm. Now use your left. One side of our body is nowhere near as fluid. It doesn't have that muscle memory. It doesn't have that elastic recoil that, for me, I played baseball for so many years. You give me a ball, my right side knows exactly what to do. My left side, I can fake it a little bit, but it's nowhere near as good as my right. You get someone into a gym environment or even a Pilates environment, and you add that rotational component. One side is always going to be a little bit goofy. It's not going to feel as well. I was working with someone the other day with just a one-arm row, and I have a new piece of equipment that actually is centripetal motion. And so as you pull it hard, it pulls back, into the eccentric, because I want to increase eccentric contraction. And one side, he was rocking. I went to the other side, and he was goofier than heck. And he kept saying, I'm in the wrong place. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. And it took us a couple of sets for him to finally start to feel like, okay, I feel like, and I explained, it's just your body figuring it out.
Right. Motor control isn't as developed on that side.
Exactly.
Right. And the myofascial patterns. So motor control, myofascial patterns, however you want to talk about that. The coordination is not there on that side.
Right.
So it hasn't been trained.
So that's why when I always go back, I like to look at the functional lines, because those are the ones that seem to involve more rotation and seem to involve things that we're going to be utilizing. I mean, you look at everybody out there, if you want to go on your computer, you can look at the superficial front line of Tom Myers, which I think, just basically is all the anterior muscles. It goes from sternocleidomastoid all the way down through the rectus abdominis, and then it makes a jump into the quadriceps. For me, functionally, I look at the pubic sheath area, the anterior portion that I consider the fascial sling of the anterior, attaching more to the adductor than I ever do the quadricep.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, that's going to shorten every time. If I'm doing a rotation, if I'm moving my body in a unilateral motion, I'm going to automatically look at that adductor firing across the body much more than I would in that sagittal plane. And again, that's why my eyes are always drawn to that functional stuff. And I think that goes more in line with even Diane Lee's look at the body.
Yep. So looking at those slings, again, there's a lot of models for it, but...
And this is Diane Lee's look at it is more sling model. Is that right?
Diane Lee's a sling model,
okay.
Right. So she's really looking at that. I mean, she's focusing primarily, at least my understanding, her sling model on lumbar-pelvic stability and dynamic control is really kind of where her focus is, at least my understanding of that. So she takes, and she really is just looking at the core. So she takes basically external oblique across to internal oblique to adductor for the anterior oblique sling, and then in the posterior, she goes from the lat through the thoracolumbar fascia to the opposite glute to create those diagonals across the body.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, one other thing to think about with all this is all of these are models and metaphors.
Right.
Okay. So yes, there are definitely connections that can go from my rectus abdominis to my quadricep. If I'm in a squat, I'm going to be basically, that's going to be what I'm going to be doing. If I'm jumping, there's going to be a connection there.
Mm-hmm.
If on the other hand, I'm riding a horse, I may well have that connection going into my adductors.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there's lots of different ways that these go. And one of the things that I like to think about when I look at Tom Myers or any of these is these are great, again, as models and metaphors. And sometimes you're going to be working with somebody who has a strange other pathway they have to use to do a particular job. I trained a lot of synchronized swimmers, Olympic synchronized swimmers, which is really interesting because they have the strangest ways of keeping themselves upright in the water.
I was going to say, that's a very specific, narrow focus. Yeah.
Right. And it's completely right. It's water-based. It's not land-based. It's whatever water is semi-open. I don't want to call that in terms of open chain or closed chain, but it's a different kind of resistance. And for example, in the legs, they do this egg beater thing. Right. They call it egg beaters, which is what keeps their torso out of the water if they're doing something with their arms, right? And they're basically like moving their legs in this funny spiral where one's coming and one's coming out. If I think about the functional lines or even think about any of the myofascial lines, they don't really account for the connections that have to happen to do that because it's just changing from front to back to inside to outside to rotation to right. There's a lot of things going on there. And so when I think about a lot of the people that I've trained for specific activities, like then they're using different pathways for that particular action, whatever it is. A golfer is going to use a different pathway than a tennis player.
Right.
There's some similarities, but there's some differences. The pelvis moves differently. The hips move differently, right? And again, those are going to be pathways that get developed on that particular person. And that's something that, as movers, that's what we're doing. We're training different pathways to be successful in doing whatever activity we're trying to do.
I like that thought. Like anybody who creates a system, everybody sort of wants it to be the panacea. They want it to answer all the questions. And in reality, nothing is going to answer all the questions because as human beings, there's way too many variables in the situation, like you just said. And you brought that up, and I was thinking, oh, well, that's very similar to water polo people who I've trained back in Hawaii. You know, because they have to do very similar. Now, they're not sticking with just the egg beater because they're not staying in one place. They have to move laterally forward, back, all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of that as well. So they go from scissor kick to lateral to they're doing all of these other things. But it's very similar in that you can't just say, oh, you're using this unit or you're using this line.
No, they're changing, right? Just like every second around as they go around, like boom, 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 because they're doing adductors and they're abductors and then they're rotating and then they're kicking. Like, it's much more complex than that. It's not it's not a simple repetitive motion. It's not even swimming.
Right.
Right. Which again is a repetitive motion where you're doing the same thing over and over, relatively in the same way.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. But these meridians or units, whatever you want to call it, does explain in general how we connect the body from one piece to the other. It does sort of have that connection.
And you know, I remember when Thomas Myers first sort of appeared on the scene, which was probably 2000 something, so 20 some odd years ago now. And it was like, from my perspective, it was like, thank God somebody is finally talking about movement, not from a one joint, one muscle perspective. Yes. Right? It was like, oh, let's look at anatomy as an integrated whole rather than as individual bits.
Yep.
Now, you guys, and if you know me, I teach anatomy, and I think understanding individual bits is important. Some people say, well, just throw out the individual bits. We'll just learn the trains. You still got to understand the individual bits,
Absolutely.
I think. But then you've got to look beyond that to go, where is that connecting? How does that bicep come down and go into that forearm? And then what does that do to the forearm musculature? Like, what are the connections? What are the communication pathways between the different bits?
That's an interesting, what you just said makes all the sense in the world to me, how it communicates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's communication of energy. It's communication of force between all the different bits from, if you're throwing a ball from your toes to your fingertips.
Yep.
It has to come all the way up. If you're pushing off with a leg, if you're rotating through your hips, your spine, your thoracic, your arm, all of it. And it's a communication. And that communication is done by your fascia.
Right. Exactly. So do you want to talk about the neurobiology of fascia a little bit then with that idea?
Yeah, let's jump into that. Before we get into that, though, just want to remind people you're listening to Moving Conversations. This is Nora. I'm Brian. Do us a favor. If you like the podcast, please subscribe. That way you get it every Tuesday. It jumps right into your feed, and you can listen to us on your way to work or whatnot. If you really like us, give us a 5-star rating. That helps with all these algorithms. And again, I know nothing about that stuff, but they say it helps. So as many likes and as many subscribes and all of that as we can get, the better it is. Our email is movingconvos@gmail.com. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter @movingconvos, how you can reach us. All right, let's jump into the nervous system. And this is going to be, we're jumping in now.
Okay. So one of the things that we talk about, right, is how do we coordinate the action of all those pieces to throw a ball or to hit a tennis ball or even just to run, right? How do all those pieces come together and how does that timing occur at the right time?
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the things that intrigued me when I first learned about Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles, right, is that basically these are some of the systems in the body, the proprioceptive systems in the body that tell us where we are in space, right? So there's little sensors inside our muscles, sensors also at our joints, which let us know how fast our muscles are moving, how quickly they're contracting or stretching, and are basically designed, or at least as they've been explained, they're basically designed to keep us from going too far or too fast and causing damage.
That's how I've always explained it, is they're protective mechanisms within the muscles so that you're not going to take a stretch too far. You're not going to, cause too much of a contraction or a release of a contraction beyond its, natural point that it wants to stop.
Right, it's essentially maintaining the integrity of the joints, right? Keeping the joints from getting overblown, overloaded in some way or other. So that was always interesting to me, but it was kind of like, well, that's interesting, but a whole lot of our proprioception happens not at our end ranges.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you guys, if you're sitting here watching this, or if you're driving, you're probably not at your end range anywhere.
Right.
You know, if you're just sitting in your car and you got your hands on the wheel, your fingers may be at their end range around that. You may maximize that based on the grip. But basically everything, but you know where your body is. You know where all the body parts are. You know what's moving and what's not moving right now. And one of the things that is, in some ways, for me, one of the most fascinating things about fascia is this neurological component within the fascial structure. So one thing we haven't talked about here is glide between fascial structures, between structures. So glide between muscles, glide between the skin and the muscles,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. One thing we've talked about a few times, or I've mentioned anyway, is when muscles are sliding against each other. For example, if I'm doing a bicep curl, my bicep is contracting and shortening, my tricep is lengthening on the opposite side of that antagonism, agonist reaction. And the funny thing for me was that can be a lot of motion. That can be inches worth of movement, a change between those two structures.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So that means that those structures, which are right next to each other, they're like one's on the front, one's in the back. They're like a sandwich with a fascial layer in between, a little fascial space in between. They have to be able to glide in order to do what they need to do. Right? They're forced. They need to be able to, one needs to be able to glide this way while one's gliding that way to create that elbow flexion.
Okay.
Okay. Got that view? So, what's happening in that space between those structures is there's a ton of neurological input that's happening in those spaces.
Now I like that you described it sort of as a sandwich. You know, because if you look at it, let's say we take a cross section of our skin, muscle, connective tissue, all of that. You take a cross section of that, and you're looking at it from the side. So the top would be the epidermis. That would be your skin. Underneath that would be fatty tissue and things like that, loose areolar tissue.
And fascia that's in there.
Right.
That connects the skin down to the deep layer.
Right. So that would be the loose connective tissue or loose fascia, right?
Yes.
So that's
there's
the
a lot
superficial.
Of there's a lot of nomenclature weirdness, but yes.
The
superficial fascia or the loose fascia, different terms for it, but yeah.
So that's the one that's on the more top side. Then underneath that layer would be more of the dense connective tissue, the thicker connective tissue.
Like what covers a chicken breast when you take off the skin.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that everybody sort of can picture what that sandwich looks like, because that's a great way to look at it from the side, as you see those layers and you can see the fat, you can see a layer of fascia, you can see where the muscle would be. And in between all of that, you're also going to have your neural connections, your blood supply, arteries, veins, all of that sort of thing as well.
Right, but I want to go one layer deeper, which is that it's not just skin to skin, but muscle to muscle.
Okay.
That there's going to be the fascia of, again, your triceps.
Yep.
And the fascia of your biceps that surround the muscles. And then between there is some very mobile fascial connections between those two muscles. And these are fibers, fascial fibers that basically change shape and move and glide around each other. It's a very moist environment that allows those tissues to glide.
Right.
Okay. And that's what creates our ability to move, essentially. If we can't glide, we can't move. And as we get older, or if you've got a client who has an injury, I'm going to divert here and then I'll come back. If you're at a client who has an injury, who has a scar, in your case, which you were just talking about, like has a spinal fusion, somewhere where things are not moving anymore, that creates that sense of stiffness, that sense of lack of range of motion, some of those issues. So what happens in that in-between space, that intermuscular space, if you will, is these nerve endings. And these nerve endings are there two kinds. One is nociception, so that is a pain perception,
right? And
that responds to changes in chemistry, so pH changes, inflammatory markers, that kind of thing will lead to irritation and pain, damage, obviously, to the tissues. The other one is proprioception.
Mm-hmm.
So as fluid moves in between those muscles, so let's say I, do a bicep pull, right? I'm like basically flexing my elbow. That's going to squeeze that muscle, increase the pressure inside that muscle, right? And do different thing to the pressure on the triceps. That muscle, that change is going to squeeze the space between those two muscles.
Mm-hmm.
And what that will do is it will move water through that space. Water pressure is one of the primary things that the proprioceptors within the fascia sense.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So that basically, as that water is moving through, as that pressure changes, the proprioception, the proprioceptors within that know like things are moving quickly, things are moving slowly, things are contracting a lot, things are not contracting so much. They have that very, very subtle understanding of exactly how much tone and speed and direction are happening in the muscles that they're next to.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully that all made sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So along with our Golgi tendon organs and our muscle spindles, you have this incredibly refined, very fine-tuned proprioceptive sense between every single layer of every single muscle, and between a lot of the different layers of fascia, even some between the skin and the deep fascia underneath it.
Now, you just mentioned water. And
Yes.
something we know is as we age, our connective tissue has a
Dry
tendency to dry up. Yes, we get dry. And drinking is not going to help. It's not, we're talking on a
No.
cellular level.
Yeah.
So what is actually happening with the fascia itself? Is the fascia just drying out and becoming more dehydrated? Is it becoming thicker and more viscous? Like, the difference between water and, let's say, something like butter or, lard, something that's going to have more density to it, but still has movement and still has some, lack of a better word, fluidity to it?
So some of this I don't know the answer to all of this, but I'll answer what I can. So two things. One, as we age, so fascia is primarily, or one of the primary things it's made up is collagen.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Collagen changes with age. It gets a little stiffer, a little more brittle. If you think about wrinkles, right? When you're a kid, if any of you have children, particularly, like look at their skin. It doesn't have a lot of wrinkles. It's very smooth. The collagen is very plump and very, very juicy, if you will. As you age, and if you have any very, very older relatives, I think of this one guy I saw in Ireland who was like the most wrinkliest face I'd ever seen. It's dry, right? That collagen loses its elasticity because it's collagen. And there's other tissues there as well that relate to the flexibility of the collagen, and those change composition as we age. So the chemical structure of the fascia changes slightly with time. Now, one of the things that decreases the likelihood of that is, oddly enough, movement.
Yeah.
Right? Movement, like motion is lotion. That old saying is absolutely true, that stimulation is what keeps the collagen as healthy as it can be, keeps it hydrated and moving within this fluid system that it lives within. One other thing, so that's one side of that. Another side of that is there's stuff called glycosaminoglycans,
Right.
which is this
Gag molecules.
Basically, it's the lubricant, also called GAGs, but it's basically the lubricant that is within the fascia, or one component of the lubrication within the fascia. There's a lot of other things into this. Again, it's hard to do the chemistry and all that stuff. But basically, glycosaminoglycans is also called the ground substance, and that's essentially the fluid that is within all of these spaces. And it contains the fibroblasts and the mast cells and the things that produce the fibers, and it lubricates a lot of that. It produces, and it's there. It contains hyaluronic acid and other things that keep all of that area working. So enough of that. But
how I always, have taught it, and I think I learned this from a professor of mine, is if you ever watch concrete go down and you see rebar and you see, all the substances that have to go in before the concrete goes into it. So you have your collagen, you have your elastin, you have all of those type of structures. But then you pour this ground substance in, which is the cement, that goes in there and sort of takes up all of the other space. within that unit. And that's how, in my mind, it's always like, oh, okay, so it fills up all of that around the collagen, elastin, and the chemicals that are in there and whatnot.
I'm going to use even a slightly more domestic model, which is a Jello mold full of things.
Oh, mm-hmm.
Okay, now I'm going to use it a couple ways. One, because gelatin is primarily collagen, so there's that. And if any of you've ever made Jello, and I know this is like, I don't know, it's not the 1950s. Who makes Jello anymore? But should you make Jello and you fill it up with something like, I don't know, spaghetti. I'm being totally random here. Or something stringy.
What kind of holiday dish do you make?
Yeah, seriously. Well, you maybe shredded carrot or something, right? Something shreddy. So if you've ever made gelatin, like you liquefy it, right? You heat it up, you liquefy it, you put in the stuff, then you put it in a mold, then you put it in the refrigerator, then it chills and it gets firm. So glycosaminoglycans and this whole fascia structure is similar in this sense. When you wake up in the morning, it is literally, sometimes people call this kind of like mucus or snot, okay? So I know these are lovely, lovely images I have for you this morning. But basically what happens there is that as you warm things up, so as I move, this ground substance becomes more fluid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? As I cool down, as I stop moving, it gets thicker. All right, so you think about, like, if you ever had a cold, like there's that runny snot that's just coming out of your nose like water, and then there's those days when it's like more like yellow, gooky, sticky stuff. The ground substance is a bit like that, and heat and movement are what keep it fluid.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so that's another reason. That's why warming up, whether you believe in it or not, warming up actually does help to liquefy and stimulate that ground substance, allowing our muscles to glide more easily and to move better.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, because for years I've tried to explain to clients, why do we warm up? And I've always said your tissues need to be at a certain temperature before they work properly. Now, yes, I can pick something up off the floor. My muscles are going to work properly. But before we want to train them in any specific way or any, difficult way where we're putting a lot more force than just, lifting up a grocery bag, we want the tissues to be at a certain temperature. And now it's making sense that it's actually the fascia that's really, we're trying to warm up, and we're trying to get that moving so that we're going to move better and not feel so stiff, not feel so, I mean, how many of us have had clients come in and say, man, I feel stiff today. I feel like I'm not moving well. And then once they warm up, they're like, oh yeah, I'm feeling better. So it's really your fascial suit you're warming up.
It's your fascial suit you're warming up, exactly. You're lubricating your whole fascial suit, like, oil can in Wizard of Oz.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's a good way to sort of look at it. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that.
So we talked a bit about just fascia, a bit about what it is, a bit about what it does, thinking about that glide component, thinking about the integration and coordination component, a little bit about elastic recoil, and a bit about kind of this warming up piece. So is there anything else we want to cover in our first kind of fascia introduction?
I'm gonna use the holiday season and say, think of this as a tree. This is the tips of the trees that we did today. Okay, we just covered the basics of fascia, and hopefully in a way that's going to help you understand a little bit more of, oh, here are the components, here's what makes up fascia, and here's what it does. And we covered a little bit of the meridians. I think our next episode, let's dive in a little deeper and explain how these work more with movement. And how, I mean, you said it, we just covered it right there. Movement is critical. Motion is lotion. Movement is critical, which is why I had a gentleman come in recently who had a knee replacement, needed to be rehabbed afterwards. The guy looked 45. He was 72 or 73 years old. And his goal is, it's almost ski season. I got to go snowboarding. So I need my knee stronger for snowboarding. I'm like, dude, you're in your 70s and you're snowboarding. I'm thinking, amazing. He has stayed active most of his life. And yes, he's worn out his knees. That's why he had them replaced. But you know what? He stayed in motion and his tissues looked great. Now, I'm sure genetics has a lot to do with that as well. But we all have those clients who never moved throughout their whole life. They were very sedentary people. And at age 60, 65, they look like an old person. And I think we've all had the person who comes to us who at 60 or 65 is like, no, I got tennis tomorrow and I've got golf and then I've got this and I've got that. And they never stop moving. And you know what? They usually don't look their age. They usually look a lot better for their age. Oftentimes they may be wrinkly because of sunlight and all that kind of stuff, but in general, they're moving better and their bodies respond better. So motion is so important.
I always laugh when I go to Kaiser. I'm a Kaiser patient, and I walk in and, I'm in my early 60s now. And I'm like, nowhere makes me feel healthier. I always came out going, I am young and spry. I'm moving well. I don't look like I'm 112. I'm not like, moaning when I get on my chair. Like, I feel really young when I'm in that circumstance.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, I am young and spry. We got this going because I'm going to keep moving as long as I possibly can.
I had that exact same experience the first time I saw a new back doctor. I get there early. I'm sitting in the waiting room, 20 minutes early just because that's who I am. And I'm watching all the people going into him. And I've got, I had low back pain and whatnot. And I'm watching people come in with walkers and with wheelchairs and barely able to move and people helping them in. That when I went, the doctor walked in and said, so what's going on today? I said, nothing. I feel great. I'm doing all right, man. And he laughed and he said, no, really? I said, I've got a little bit of back pain, but nothing compared to all those people.
Right.
It will tell you, okay, I got to keep moving.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we covered a lot. We're going to dive in a little deeper next time. So we're going to get more into how movement actually helps. In general, I think we just have to keep on moving. Thanks for joining us on Moving Conversations. I'm sure this has sparked a little bit more of your interest in fascia. We've probably covered a lot of things that you've probably heard about. You've probably, thought about or whatnot or heard here or there. Hopefully we were able to, shine a flashlight on it a little bit more and clarify some things. We're hoping to do even more next time. Hopefully we'll just keep your brain engaged until next week. If you have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please drop us a line, movingcombos@gmail.com.